In 1948, China was divided between two ideological rivals. On one side was the Nationalist Party, Kuomintang, led by Chiang Kai-shek. On the other side was the Chinese Communist Party, led by Mao Zedong. In practice, the only years of truce between them were after Imperial Japan invaded China in 1937. Nationalists and communists were forced into a temporary, convenient alliance against the external enemy, and the internal war moved to the background for a few years. As soon as the Second World War ended in 1945, the civil war between nationalists and communists resumed immediately, with full force and brutality. By 1948, the result was a country cut into different zones of control. In the north and in the interior, the communists had already taken Manchuria and large rural regions, supported by peasants and by weapons captured from the Japanese. In the south and along the coast, there were still major cities under nationalist control, such as Shanghai, Fuzhou, Canton, Guangzhou, and the escape route toward Taiwan and ports like Hong Kong. After advancing in the north, the Communist Army began moving down toward the Yangtze River Valley. That valley acted as the last major defensive line before the richer and more urban south. For people living in nationalist areas, the north was practically lost, the center was an active war zone, and the south still offered a chance to escape. So people started fleeing to the south. Ships like the SS Kiangya stopped being just regular passenger transport and turned into evacuation ships. Everyone who boarded had the same goal: to get as far away as possible from the front lines and from the communist advance. The SS Kiangya was originally a Japanese design. It was a robust passenger and cargo ship, built in 1939 in Japan, and first named Shingya Maru. It was a steel-hulled steamship, designed for coastal routes, meant to carry many people and cargo on relatively short trips. After the Chinese victory in the so-called War of Resistance against Japan, the ship was requisitioned by the naval headquarters of the nationalist government. It was then transferred to the Shanghai Steam Navigation Company. During this transition, it was renamed Kiangya. The Kiangya could carry about 2,250 passengers, a high number for a regional route ship. It had a restaurant and first-class lounges, with an appearance and facilities considered excellent for the standards of that time. It was even described as one of Shanghai's 6 new large passenger ships. Its regular route was relatively short, about 12 hours between Shanghai and Ningbo. Before 1948, it had completed that trip safely on more than 800 round voyages. In short, it was one of the main passenger ships in the region, with a solid record of regular operations. On Friday, December 3, 1948, under calm skies over Shanghai, the SS Kiangya was moored at the Shiliupu Wharf. It was one of the main passenger embarkation points on the banks of the Huangpu River, facing the central area of the city. From there, the ship began its regular route between Shanghai and Ningbo. At around 3 p.m., the crew started checking tickets and boarding passengers at berth number 3 in Shiliupu. Lines stretched along the pier. Migrant workers from Ningbo who lived in Shanghai, families carrying cloth bags and suitcases, people bringing money, jewelry, and documents. To this day, no one knows exactly how many people were on the Kiangya's final voyage. According to the passenger list preserved in the Shanghai archives, 2,207 tickets were sold on December 3rd. If we add the 186 crew members, the official total for that day would be 2,393 people on board. These are the numbers that can be confirmed on paper, but the real number was much higher. Amid political chaos and fear of war, a parallel boarding system emerged. A large number of passengers boarded without tickets, using connections, intermediaries known as scalpers, who managed to push people on board outside official control in exchange for bribes. This opened the door to a lot of speculation and, at the same time, to many consistent reports of overcrowding far beyond what was recorded in documents. Over the decades, journalists and investigators have tried to reconstruct the disaster. Most concluded that the total number of people on board exceeded 3,200 and may have reached 4,000 or even 4,600 people. When the SS Kiangya left Shanghai, it entered a navigation area that had been mined during the war. Officially, the main channels had been cleared, but everyone knew there was still a risk. Old mines, poorly charted or moved by the current, could still be active outside the main routes. During the Second World War, the Yangtze estuary and the approaches to Shanghai had been heavily mined by different forces. The Japanese, the Chinese nationalists, and in some areas even by Allied operations. Mines were used to block enemy shipping, protect strategic ports, and control navigation channels. The problem was that after 1945, mine clearance was incomplete and inconsistent. China came out of a war against Japan and fell straight back into a civil war. There were not enough resources, coordination, or even reliable charts showing exactly where each minefield had been laid. Some areas were swept and officially declared safe. Others continued to be used simply because ships had always sailed there, even without any real guarantee of safety. The estuary where the Kiangya was sailing combined three bad factors: a history of wartime minefields, many old but still active; heavy civilian traffic, especially ships leaving Shanghai; a weak and distracted state, more focused on not losing cities to the enemy than on checking whether the navigation lanes were completely clear. In the middle of the afternoon, the Kiangya cast off its lines and began heading down the Huangpu River. At first, the ship passed along urban banks with heavy traffic of small boats, and the noise of the city was part of the journey for the first hours. As time went by, the lights of Shanghai faded behind them, the river widened, and the Kiangya approached the confluence with the Yangtze on its way to the East China Sea. At some point during the night of December 3rd to 4th, 1948, a sudden explosion hit the rear section of the ship in the stern area. For those on board, the first sign was a deep boom from below, followed by a violent jolt that threw many people to the deck. The ship began to shudder violently, and then all the lights went out, plunging the interior into darkness. On impact, the wireless room collapsed almost instantly, killing the operator and cutting off any attempt to call for help. The emergency whistle managed to sound only once before going silent, as if it were the ship's last warning before disappearing. The explosion tore open the hull at a critical point near the stern and allowed a massive inflow of water. The first areas to be devastated were the 4th and 5th class cabins at the back. In just 2 or 3 minutes, seawater was already up to people's waists in those compartments. Men, women, and children began pushing toward the exits, trying to reach the upper deck. Survivors later reported that because many passengers had tried to travel without paying, ticket checks continued even after the ship left port. To control the flow, the crew had locked the iron doors of the cabins, which at the moment of the explosion prevented many from escaping. Within minutes, those corridors turned into traps. One survivor described it this way: "Screams and crying filled the air. Many elderly people, women, and children were trampled to death. It was a scene of indescribable horror." Individual cases help visualize what was happening inside that collapsing ship. At the moment of the explosion, one survivor, a man named Jin Guoping, was holding his son and standing with his wife just outside their 3rd class cabin. The blast under his feet almost knocked him down. While he tried to calm his wife, the water began to rise quickly. The stern sank, the ship rolled over, and all 3 of them were thrown into the sea. The accident happened in a shallow bank area. For a short time, it was still possible to see the funnel, the mast, and one lifeboat hanging above the water. In the chaos, no one managed to release that boat. Outside, the screams grew weaker as the tide rose. Inside, there was no time left. Estimates suggest that the gap between the explosion and the sinking was only about 3 to 5 minutes. On an overcrowded ship, with locked doors and packed compartments, that meant most people went down with the hull, still trapped inside. Some nearby vessels, small freighters, tugboats, and local boats, realized that something had happened. Some saw flashes of light, others heard the blast, and others noticed people and debris drifting in the water. These boats approached carefully and began pulling survivors on board. By that time, it was already night, and visibility was very limited. The water in the estuary was murky, with a strong current, and many survivors had no life jackets. They were exhausted, and some were injured by the explosion. Even so, it was these smaller vessels that rescued most of the people who managed to get out of the hull in time. Only later, as fragmented reports reached the port of Shanghai, were larger ships sent to the area. Estimates suggest that between 700 and 1,000 people were rescued alive. The next day, all that was still visible was the funnel, part of the mast, and the hull partially submerged on the shallow bank. To this day, there is still disagreement about the exact cause of the sinking, whether it was an explosion in the ship's own boiler or an impact with a naval mine. The most widely accepted explanation, supported by historical investigations, is that the steamship SS Kiangya struck a submerged mine, a leftover from the Second Sino-Japanese War. Even though this was a routine route and many ships had passed through that area, it was still a region with a long history of minefields. Officially, it was considered clean enough for use, but there was always residual risk. During the war, the Yangtze estuary and the approaches to Shanghai were mined by different military forces. The Imperial Japanese Navy, which occupied much of the Chinese coast, used mines to protect ports and their own routes, and to block enemy ships. In the final phase of the war, the Allies, especially the United States and the United Kingdom, began attacking Japanese logistics not only with bombing, but also with aerial mining. Aircraft dropped mines at the entrances to ports and in navigable stretches of the Yangtze to cut the flow of supplies and fuel to Japanese troops in China. In some sectors, units linked to the nationalist government also laid mines along coastal and river areas, aiming to protect zones under Chinese control and restrict enemy shipping in strategic points. After 1945, China emerged from the war against Japan and fell immediately into civil war. As a result, mine clearance was done only partially and unevenly. The rival parties were more concerned with fighting each other than with the safety and well-being of the civilian population. 1, 2, 3. The explosion split the hull into two large sections. For years, these wrecks lay on the shallow bank, partially visible and obstructing navigation. In 1956, already under the new government of the People's Republic of China, authorities decided to remove the hull so that the area of the river could be dredged. The two halves of the ship were lifted and taken away in an operation that lasted about 160 days. The sections of the vessel were taken to a shipyard in Shanghai, where they went through a process of repair and reconstruction. The rebuilt ship returned to service on February 4, 1959, once again departing from the Shiliupu Wharf in Shanghai, the same point from which it had left in 1948. This time, however, it operated as a local ferry and a regional line vessel, including river transport between Shanghai and Wuhan. The hull that had once been at the center of one of the deadliest civilian maritime disasters in history was back in operation, now under a new phase of Chinese history. In November 1966, the ship was renamed Dongfang Hong 8. It remained in service until the early 1980s, when the fleets were modernized. The vessel, originally built in 1939, was finally retired from service in 1983. Interestingly, during dismantling operations in June 2000, a large oil fire broke out at the scrapping site, and this incident is also recorded in notes about the ship. In the months following the sinking, China's political situation changed completely. The nationalist regime retreated to Taiwan, and the mainland came under the control of the Communist Party. The Kiangya disaster ended up in a kind of blind spot of historical memory. For the nationalist government, it was tied to a period of collapse and defeat, with little interest in being remembered. For the new communist government, the priority was to consolidate power and build other narratives about that era, not to revisit a maritime accident that had happened on a ship operated under the old regime. The Kiangya disaster was not an isolated accident. It was a symptom of a country in collapse. And the most disturbing part is that less than 2 months later, another ship would leave Shanghai in similar conditions and meet a similar fate. Its name was Taiping. When the Kiangya sank in the Yangtze estuary, China was already entering the final phase of the nationalist collapse. Within a few weeks, the situation grew even worse. Large offensives by the People's Liberation Army pushed nationalist forces further south, destroying entire divisions, and making it clear that Chiang Kai-shek's government would not be able to hold the mainland for much longer. In this context, Shanghai was still under nationalist control, but it was already seen as a city on a countdown. Everyone knew its fall was close. At the same time, Taiwan stopped being just an island administered by the KMT and began to be seen as a final refuge, the place where soldiers, officials, businessmen, journalists, entire families, and anyone who did not want to live under the new communist regime would try to go. Ports like Shanghai turned into exit points. Cargo ships, passenger steamers, and converted freighters started to operate as evacuation bridges, making repeated crossings to Taiwan. On every trip, the logic was the same: overcrowding, haste, documents and valuables piled together with people. Officially, it was a passenger ship. In practice, it was being used as an escape ship, carrying people who had no intention of ever coming back. The Taiping was a passenger ship that sailed between Shanghai and the port of Keelung in Taiwan, carrying civilians and cargo between the mainland and the island. On paper, it was just a regular scheduled steamer, operating on a fixed route amid the heavy coastal traffic of late 1940s China. But in early 1949, the practical role of that route changed. As communist forces advanced across the mainland, many people began to see the trip from Shanghai to Taiwan as a chance to leave the continent forever, before the official change of power. Because of that, the profile of the passengers also changed. Among those on board the Taiping were government employees linked to the nationalist regime, traveling with their families and more luggage than a normal traveler. There were also soldiers and former soldiers, some in civilian clothes, with wives, children, and relatives. Businessmen, merchants, and urban professionals carried documents, cash, jewelry, and part of their assets converted into cargo. And there were ordinary civilians, people with no major political role, but who feared the future under the new regime and tried to move to Taiwan on their own, bringing everything they could. On its final voyage, the Taiping was carrying far more people than its nominal capacity of 580 passengers. Estimates suggest that more than 1,000 people were on board, with some figures reaching around 1,500 passengers and crew combined. In practice, that meant crowded decks, corridors filled with people sitting or lying on top of luggage, and cargo spaces used to house refugees and their belongings. The Taiping was scheduled to depart on the morning of January 27, 1949, but it only left in the late afternoon, after 4 p.m. On the pier, the atmosphere mixed normal port routine with a sense of urgency. Families carried large suitcases, trunks, and cloth bags. Some soldiers walked around without full uniform. Company employees brought boxes filled with documents and equipment. The pressure for space was intense, and the line between paying passenger, refugee squeezed in at the last minute, and family member or companion became increasingly blurred. The planned route was to leave Shanghai, cross Hangzhou Bay, pass around the Zhoushan archipelago, and from there sail an open sea until reaching Keelung, on the northern coast of Taiwan. In the early hours of January 27, 1949, the Taiping was moving through the Zhoushan archipelago, already beyond Hangzhou Bay and heading toward open sea. It was a tricky stretch of navigation. Low-lying islands, narrow channels, reefs, and traffic from other vessels also moving along the coast in the middle of a civil war. To avoid being seen, or even mistaken for the enemy, ships had orders to use as few lights as possible. so the Taiping moved through the night with almost no exterior lights. From a military point of view, this made sense. A less visible ship is harder to identify or attack. From a nautical point of view, it meant that any other vessel would only notice its presence when it was already close. That night, the Qianyuan was also passing through the archipelago. It was coming from Taiwan toward Shanghai, carrying about 2,700 tons of cargo. The Qianyuan was a steel cargo ship built to a First World War-era design. It had been constructed in 1919 in Norway for French owners, then sold and renamed several times before being purchased in 1948 by a shipping company based in Shanghai. After that, the Qianyuan operated as a commercial freighter linking Taiwan to the mainland, mainly carrying coal and timber. Around midnight, the paths of the Taiping and the freighter Qianyuan crossed. The Qianyuan was also sailing in very limited visibility. In the dark sea, with faint reflections and without full navigation lights, the two ships closed in on each other too quickly to correct course and collided violently. The bow of the Taiping cut into the Qianyuan at the level of the second cargo hold, effectively at the ship's midsection. The freighter's hull, loaded with 2,700 tons of coal and timber, was torn open and flooded rapidly. The Qianyuan sank in about 5 minutes after the impact. The Taiping was still able to stay afloat. Even though it was seriously damaged, it still had propulsion and some stability. The crew tried to buy time and turn the sinking into a controlled grounding. The captain headed toward areas where he might be able to drive the hull intentionally into shallow water and keep the ship from going down in deep water. The order was to stay underway and move closer to the coast. Inside the ship, the water that was coming in started to spread through the internal compartments. The weight of the cargo and of so many people made the ship respond more slowly to any course correction. As the list increased, corridors and stairways became harder to use. In many parts of the ship, passengers still did not even know they had collided with another vessel. The shore was only a few minutes away. The Taiping came to within about 500 meters of an island. In that short window, it tried to maneuver along the coastline and look for a more favorable spot to run aground. At that moment, an explosion occurred in the engine room area, and the ship began to sink. The water was cold enough to cause hypothermia. There were not enough life jackets for the real number of people on board. Many passengers were asleep, barefoot or lightly dressed, and had no time to reach the boats. On top of that, fuel oil spread across the surface. Those who managed to reach the surface came up covered in oil, with burning eyes and difficulty breathing. Few people knew exactly which direction to swim. Many clung to pieces of wood, parts of the superstructure, or any object that could float. Mixed in with them were the few survivors from the Qianyuan, who had escaped the freighter before it went under. The survivors who stayed alive long enough on the surface were rescued in 2 waves. Fishermen from the Zhoushan Islands, familiar with the local sea, arrived first and managed to pull some people out of the water in small boats. Hours later, in daylight, the Australian destroyer HMAS Warramunga, which was on patrol in the area, passed through the debris field. The crew found large oil slicks, scattered timbers, and people still clinging to planks and pieces of hull. They launched boats and recovered around 30 survivors, including men who had come from both the Qianyuan and the Taiping itself. Adding those rescued by the fishermen and by the Warramunga, the final number of survivors was around 50 people. The total number of victims from both ships reached about 1,500. In any case, it ranks as one of the worst civilian shipwrecks of the 20th century, even though it is little known outside Asia. The company that owned the Taiping was held civilly liable, and the insurance firm involved could not withstand the financial impact and collapsed. Most of the other owners of the Taiping's operating company left Shanghai for Taiwan or for other countries, fleeing the weight of the compensation claims. One of them, however, made the opposite choice. He also had the means to leave with his family and his assets. But he decided to stay in Shanghai to face the lawsuits, negotiate with the families of the victims, and try to pay what he could. According to accounts, he did not want to spend the rest of his life being seen as the owner who ran away and left the dead behind. He preferred to sell property, use what was left of the fleet, and put his own wealth at risk in order to honor, even if only partially, the compensation payments. If you want to go deeper into this part of the story, who this owner was, how the hearings unfolded, and how he tried to handle the compensation, the link is in the description below. If you made it this far, thank you for watching. I hope to see you in the next videos.